What if every single star we see scattered across the night sky is not just a silent point of light drifting through an empty void, but a small clue pointing towards something far larger and far more intentional, waiting just beyond the visible horizon? What if they are a part of a deeper wisdom that has been at the center of everything all along? Written across the heavens in sacred geometry and silver starlight since the very beginning. It sounds like a strange question to ask at first. At least, it is until we adjust our sight by even the slightest degree. Because every time we look from a different perspective, we keep finding things that don't quite fit conventional theory. Instead, we find something that looks less and less like a totally random mixing of energy, and atoms, and chaos, and more like the organized patterns of an immense cosmic map, one that, oddly enough, our oldest ancestors had already started to decipher, long before the very concept of science or astronomy had even been invented. And if we pause to listen carefully to the echoes of our past, we can still hear their whispers, whispers spoken in a dead language, whispers of a society so far removed from our own that it literally vanished from the historical record for well over 1,800 years, until archaeologists just started finding their remnants less than 2 centuries ago, unearthing the ruins of dusty libraries and vast temple archives buried in the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, in the cradle of early life. And there they found what could be the first cities and the first written records known to all mankind, records written not in paper and ink, but in the sun-cured clay of the earth itself, in cuneiform symbols designed to withstand the true test of time, left behind by a civilization so advanced that somehow they seemed to already understand some of the deepest and most foundational astronomical secrets of the study as a whole. Secrets that were said to hold the destinies of entire empires. Those are the secrets that sit at the center of tonight's exploration. Not a ghost story, not a conspiracy layered over a thin foundation of guesswork. Something documented, something genuinely strange, and in many ways more extraordinary than any legend that has been built around it since. Because the truth behind what the astronomers of ancient Sumeria actually knew, and how precisely they knew it, is one of the more quietly astonishing chapters in the entire history of human thought. Yet time and time again, conventional standards tend to paint early civilizations as primitive watchers of the sky, people who looked up with wonder and wove tall tales around what they saw. Simple observers drawing simple conclusions, gathering around the fire to name clusters of stars after animals and heroes and dreams. And that version of the story is not entirely wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete. Because the people who were there from the very start, populations that stretched far and wide from the primeval marshlands of ancient Sumer all the way to the grand ziggurats of later Babylonia, Akkad, and Assyria. Those people did not merely admire the stars with passive fascination. They revered them. They studied them with the same level of dedication as a devout priest, solemnly reciting his prayers, recording nearly every observation and newly gained insight into meticulous archives, mapping the dark expanse of space into coordinated geometric pathways, tracking planetary movements with a degree of mathematical accuracy that still leaves scholars in quiet awe. These were not passive observers watching time pass them by. They were actively charting the deepest reaches of the visible cosmos, tracing orbital paths, and deciphering what they understood to be a complex celestial blueprint, one that connected the movements of heaven directly to the fate of everything that resided below. And the question that sits underneath all of this, the question that makes serious researchers genuinely pause, is a simple one. How? How did a civilization at the very dawn of recorded history develop a science so mathematically precise that its foundations still echo through every field of modern astronomy to this day? And what greater meanings did they interpret in those celestial depths? That's the trail we're going to follow tonight. A deliberate path through our collective memory. One that has taken historians quite a while to piece together, and we're still just getting through the surface of things, because the only physical evidence we have to point to begins in the dust, and the broken fragments they left for us to find. Just imagine trying to sort through the remnants of a 19th century excavation site, somewhere in the ruins of ancient Nineveh, in what is now northern Iraq. Diggers moving through collapsed corridors, and buried archive rooms pulling fragments of clay tablets from the debris of a royal library. Walls that have not seen daylight in over 2,000 years. This was the legendary library of King Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian ruler who made it his life's work to collect and preserve all the accumulated written knowledge of the ancient world, preserving its memory, its culture, its wisdom. Thousands of clay tablets, many of them shattered by the collapse of the library's roof, were pulled from the earth and shipped to the British Museum in London. And among them were detailed star maps, precise planetary observation tables, celestial compendiums stretching back centuries, and a circular clay tablet now catalogued as Artifact K8538, which scholars would come to recognize as something truly extraordinary, a sort of early precursor to the function of a planisphere, if you will, one of the oldest known astronomical instruments ever discovered. These are just a few silent remnants of a science so carefully maintained, so methodically recorded, that it survived the collapse of the very civilization that created them, buried in fine desert dust for millennia, waiting to be read again. Tiny wedge-shaped marks, the living messages of those that lived 5,000 years before us, and encoded in those marks the precise coordinates of their stars, measured angles, intelligent notations, tracked movements, a record not of myth or prayer, but of careful observation, repeated and stretched across generations of diligent watchers, standing in the darkness of a moonless night from their high mud-brick platforms, eyes turned upward, instruments raised toward the sky. Now these were not any kind of instruments we would currently recognize, for there were no glass lenses, no metal tubes, no computed calculations running in the background. But what they did have were sighting reeds, copper rings, and polished water basins to track the reflections of stars against something grounding, something that stood still. Simple tools by any modern measure. And yet, with those tools they tracked the intricate orbital loops of planets across years and decades and centuries beyond. They mapped meteor paths and recorded star coordinates with an accuracy that researchers still struggle to explain. An ancient priesthood, standing barefoot on a ziggurat in the dark, calculating the subtle repeating rhythms of the heavens. Generation after generation, they gazed on with a patience that closely reflected the immense spans of their grand empires, watching and recording across enough centuries and through enough time that the patterns became undeniable. But there is something else hidden in that steadfast nature, a hint to where it all came from, one that they did not intend to be a quiet suggestion, but rather a unified acknowledgement of something they did not want us to forget, something that appears again and again in every text and every artifact and every relic they left in their wake, that the wisdom they had built over millennia was not theirs alone to claim. that even the most distant ancestors they themselves could remember were simply preserving something far older than themselves, a knowledge that had been handed down from a time even they could barely recall, from an age when the gods themselves walked openly among them and first taught them the language of the sky. Any honest scholar will tell you that the questions this has stirred up have no clean answer. People have theorized and expounded on everything from ancient aliens to lost technology and more. Some agree, and some find it all too far-fetched, but in the long run perhaps that is the point, that we keep asking, keep pondering and theorizing and searching with an open mind, that we keep looking up into the same deep blue pools of reflection and wondering why it all is the way it is and how it all started, because somewhere underneath it all there does lie a shred of truth. If you are listening to this in the quiet of night, let us know where and when you are joining us from in the comments section below. It is quietly comforting to realize that listeners across distant lands and different time zones are all settling into the same quiet journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. If you enjoy this History for Sleep narrative, consider subscribing to the channel or join the Legends of the Dawn membership for uninterrupted narratives. Your support helps our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. So if your eyes feel heavy, let them fall closed slowly, softly, and let the image start to shift. The light of day grows softer, and the familiar shapes of the modern world begin to blur at the edge. The air cools, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of moving water rises slowly from beneath the silence, as if the earth itself is remembering something. The dust of those silent archives settles around you, and the boundaries of time begin to loosen their grip. Centuries dissolve into one another, like river silt carried downstream. The night sky above deepens, and the stars are sharper now, clearer, during an age with only the moonlight and the glimmer of a warm fire to soften their glow. Together we drift backward through time, past the great Assyrian palace walls, past the Babylonian astronomers bent over their tablets in the lamplight, further still, toward the first true watchers of the sky, before the flood. In a sunlit sanctuary of the antediluvian era, where priests began to take the early advancements of the first few primeval capitals to new heights, here we witness a city defined by the duality of the roaring waters, which split it down its very center, a place that was best known for basking in the golden warmth of the light, but whose true magic, interestingly enough, belongs to the night, where the first true watchers of the heavens kept constant vigil. There, materializing slowly through the haze of centuries, rising up from the flat Mesopotamian plain, like something half-remembered, is the city of Sippar, the solar city and the fourth primeval capital of the era. It had been designated as the eminent domain of Utu, the sun god, whom the Babylonians would later call Shamash, and was said to be a place where the blazing rays of the sun governed every waking hour, where the night, quiet and vast and speckled with countless heavenly orbs, belonged entirely to the astronomers. Sippar was a twin city in many ways, divided cleanly down its center by a branch of the mighty Euphrates, a river that was not merely a backdrop, it was the lifeblood of trade, splitting it in two while simultaneously connecting it to the wider world around them. Situated at a strategic crossroads to the north of what would later become the heart of Babylonia, merchants arriving here found themselves at the meeting point of two great routes, where those winding currents eventually joined in with the Tigris not far off, giving travelers and traders access to northern roads that would guide them as far as the Anatolian and Assyrian plateaus, the Jazira Plains, the Middle Euphrates, and beyond. It was a city that didn't just endure the hot rays from above, it thrived in them. A complex gridwork of irrigation canals ran out in every direction, feeding lush vegetation that draped the mud-brick terraces in green, soaking up the sun. But Sippar was much more than just a merchant city. It was also a legendary center of ancient wisdom, temple scholarship, and what the people of Mesopotamia revered as some of their most sacred archives. Its very name, many believed, carried echoes of the Akkadian word Sipru, meaning writing or inscription, and those words carried more weight than they might first suggest. Because throughout the deepest memories of Mesopotamian lore, Sippar held a singular and extraordinary placement, according to sources ranging all the way from the Sumerian king's list to the later traditions of the Babylonian priest Berossus. This city had been chosen by the gods themselves to serve as a kind of time capsule. While the great flood was building on the horizon, it was here that the wisest men gathered every clay tablet they could find. Every record, every calculation, every sacred formula, and carefully buried them in the earth, a desperate act of preservation, just before the waters surged. But the question of how Sippar had accumulated such an astonishing wealth of knowledge in the first place leads to a story that is, even by the standards of ancient myth, truly remarkable, a story that survives in the artifacts we have recovered. From the ritual tablet of the diviners to the third tablet of the incantation series of Beit Meseri, the Uruk list of kings and sages among others, it appears again and again. A tale about the seventh king chosen by the gods to guide the antediluvian empire of ancient Sumer, a sovereign named Enmeduranki, who ruled over the solar city of Sippar long before the great flood of legends, and the words they recorded about him were both direct and strange in equal measure. They describe a night when Enmeduranki and his wise sage, the last of the divine Apkallu, literally ascended to the heavens, arriving in the brilliant assembly halls of the Anunnaki themselves, to stand before the presence of Shamash, the sun god, and Adad, the storm god. And there he was given the knowledge of the holy May, the sacred language of the universe itself, formed from the primordial ether of a world that came before mankind, before there was space to breathe or light to see, before even the Anunnaki themselves. Rules said to govern all of reality, containing every bit of wisdom ever needed to achieve a truly flourishing civilization. Secret mathematical techniques, the mystical craft of divination, the deeper underlying mechanisms by which the cosmos communicated its intentions to those willing to listen. And then the gods commanded him to carry this wisdom back down to the earth below, a gift to be passed on to his descendants, written, preserved, and protected. And what followed was the beginning of something extraordinary, because it was shortly after his return that the ancient world experienced a level of growth that, even with all their prior advancements, had never been seen before. Picture the Baru, the seer priests of Sippar, settled onto the high mud-brick terraces, looking out over the land below, and more importantly, the sky above, in the absolute stillness of the desert night, the air cool and dry against the skin, the thick scent of burning cedar resin drifting effortlessly through open temple corridors, mingling with the faint sweetness of desert flowers carried in a gentle breeze. And beneath all of that, the soft rhythmic sound of reed styluses pressing the exact coordinates of distant stars, and the clusters formed therein into damp river clay, and advancing the mathematical language and pragmatic sciences that started in the marshlands of Eridu. Precise, methodical, and eternally patient in the way that those know their duties to be sacred must be, a patience that spans generations. The kind of dedication that comes from understanding, without a doubt, that you are merely the record-keeper of something much larger than yourself. Not something that was simply fabricated into existence, but something that just is, something that runs just beneath the tangible surface, carefully structuring everything we see and everything we are. And nearby, others practice new ways to see that pattern more clearly. Hovering silently in a sort of trance, ancient priests cast their gaze downward to master the esoteric art of lecanomancy, reading beautiful shifting patterns formed from ribbons of pure oil poured slowly over the still surface of cedar bowls filled with water, and watching iridescent shapes contract and expand and dissolve, and trying to decipher what the gods were saying through them. These were the first true watchers, the ones who looked up with intention night after night and wrote down exactly what they saw, and what they would eventually produce. Those records pressed into clay on the dark terraces of some of our oldest ziggurats would become some of the most extraordinary works of scientific and astronomical knowledge in all of early human history. Works that still shape how we understand time, how we practice mathematics, how we read the geometry of the universe itself to this very day. And among everything they recorded, there was a particular group of lights that demanded more attention than all the rest. Not the steady fixed stars, not the quiet, familiar glow of constellations holding their positions night after night. Those were recorded with equal care. But these were something different. 5 specific points of light that refused to stay still, that drifted, shifted, looped back in on themselves, and moved with a kind of deliberate rhythm above the rolling plains of ancient Sumer. The priests watched them from their high temple platforms, burning with a brightness that separated them from everything else the sky had to offer. The ancient astronomers gave these wandering bodies a name of their own, one that carried real weight in the old world. They called them the Bibbu, the wild sheep, entities that, like their namesake, don't follow a set path, moving with their own will, their own internal logic, and that's exactly what these lights seem to be doing, wandering through the fixed backdrop of the stars with an independence that the priests could not ignore. They watched, and they took note, and slowly across generations they began to understand that the wandering wasn't random at all. It was coherent, it was predictable, and it was something that could be mapped. By the time the Babylonian astronomers arrived, building on those Sumerian foundations of their ancestors before, the mathematics had become sophisticated enough to do something remarkable. Working with the base 60 numerical system inherited from their predecessors, Babylonian scribes discovered they could track Jupiter's movement across the sky by calculating the area beneath a trapezoid shape. This was, in effect, an early form of the integral calculus, a feat that went unmatched until European astronomers duplicated the math thousands of years later, in the 14th century. Their charts of Jupiter's orbit were accurate to within fractions of a single degree. The other planets were traced just as precisely. And behind each path was a presence. The paths of Mars, with its reddish burning quality, was understood as Nergal, or error, a god associated with plague and war. Saturn was Ninurta, slow and deliberate, a deity of agriculture and patient order. And then there was perhaps the brightest and most revered star in the sky, other than the moon itself, the star Venus, the morning and evening star. But to the ancient Sumerians there was a radiant feminine presence underneath all that brilliant glow, and they called her Inanna, Queen of Heaven, though she is now largely known under her later Babylonian title, the goddess Ishtar. The scribes who tracked her movements weren't just doing astronomy. They were following a deity through her cycles. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa documents this with a precision that still draws the attention of even the most scrupulous modern researchers. Because for over 20 years, scribes recorded exactly when she rose and set, when she vanished behind the sun and reappeared again. The tablet maps out the full 8-year pentagram cycle symbolic of Venus, with a dedication that required generations of coordinated observation to achieve. And strangely enough, her disappearances were not simply noted as simple astronomical events. There is an even older legend behind her cyclical disappearance. It was believed, throughout nearly all of Mesopotamian lore, to be a reflection of Ishtar's descent to the netherworld, a place called Ker, from which there was said to be no return. But Ishtar did return, and the price of her salvation was that her husband Dumuzi take her place beneath the earth. And it was that very exchange, the sacrifice of substitution, that was believed to set the turning of the seasons into motion. From life to death, through the long, slow rhythm of the year between, all encoded in the passage of a single planetary orbit. And the maps that recorded it, and others, continued to evolve even long after the flood. Empires rose and fell, each one building on the foundations of their ancestors. And then came an artifact unlike almost anything else that had come before it, the Planesphere of Nineveh, recovered from the ruins of the great library of King Ashurbanipal in what is now northern Iraq. This clay tablet takes on a new shape, a circular one instead of the usual rectangular tablet. It divides the entire visible night sky into 8 equal sectors of 45 degrees each, with constellations pressed into small indentations that almost ask you to reach out and trace them with your own fingers to connect the points, and cuneiform notes filling the spaces between. Even meteor paths were marked down, a portable map of the entire night sky, rendered in 360 degrees, a physical object you could hold, rotate, and read, and the positions recorded on it correspond precisely to the sky over ancient Mesopotamia on the night of January 3rd, 650 BCE. Precise enough that we can reconstruct exactly which stars were visible and where they sat in the sky on one specific evening, more than 2.5 millennia ago. Every new generation of those watchers passed it on forward. They pressed their observations into clay, and then they handed the tablets to scribes, who copied them, extended them, and added their own careful notes to the growing record, each person looking up at the same star-speckled expanse, doing their best to capture something true about what they saw above them, so that whoever came next would not have to start from the beginning. And so their wisdom grew even more rapidly than before, tablet by tablet, generation by generation, each scribe adding their own careful notes. But even among all of those accumulated observations, all those careful lists of stars, and rising times, and planetary movements, one document would eventually rise above the rest. One compilation that would draw everything together so completely that it became the foundation for nearly every astronomical tradition that followed. And that document was called the MulApin. It translates roughly as the Plough Star, named after the very first constellation listed within its opening lines. And what it represents is something genuinely remarkable. This is the oldest surviving comprehensive star catalogue we have left from any ancient culture, excavated from ancient library sites at Nineveh and Ashur. where surviving copies date to around 700 BC. But the observations written inside them date back much, much further than that. The astronomical data encoded in MulApin reflects a sky so old that it would have looked slightly different from how it appeared in 700 BC because of a slow wobble in Earth's axis called precession. And when researchers worked backward through that wobble, the observations pointed to an original source compiled somewhere around 1200 BC at the very earliest, with even deeper roots likely stretching back into the second millennium and beyond. These weren't new concepts being written down for the first time. They were far older observations and ideas finally being gathered into one place. And hidden inside those long lines of cuneiform, pressed carefully into clay by hands that knew exactly what they were preserving, are lists of 66 distinct stars and constellations, planetary paths, the dates when specific stars rise and set in correlation with the sun, notes on solstices and equinoxes, observations on weather and the seasons of the calendar. It is dense with information, and it rewards slow reading. But perhaps the most elegant thing inside MulApin isn't any single piece of data. It's the structure underneath all of it. Because the ancient astronomers who built this system didn't just record what they saw, they organized it to find a greater meaning, dividing the entire sky into 3 distinct regions, 3 great paths, each one named after the highest immortals of the Anunnaki Council, and each one governing a fixed portion of the heavens. They called them the Path of Enlil, the Path of Anu, and the Path of Ea, more commonly known as Enki, 3 names that most deep history buffs recognize immediately. Because these weren't minor figures, Enlil, Anu, and Enki were the supreme trinity of the Anunnaki Council, the 3 most powerful gods in all of ancient Mesopotamia, and here they were, carved permanently into the structure of the sky itself. Enlil ruled the northernmost arc, the god of wind and storm, the one who first breathed air into the primordial world, and his domain in the heavens reflected his elevated stature. His northern path contained 33 constellations. And what made it mathematically special was the circumpolar stars at its core. These are the stars that never set. They circle endlessly around the north celestial pole, visible every clear night of the year, never dipping below the horizon. Among Enlil's most important stars was MulApin itself, the plough which we might recognize today as part of Draco, and the heavenly wagon which corresponds to Ursa Major, the Great Bear. While the other 2 paths intersected at various points in the horizon as their stars rose and set through the seasons, Enlil's path formed a continuously unbroken circle that remained untouched, spinning endlessly around the northern pole. Enki's domain, in direct contrast, lay at the opposite end of the sky. His southern path sat low on the horizon, close to the edge of visibility, where stars appear to rise briefly and then sink back below the line of the earth, kept in perfect place by Enki, the god of deep water and hidden wisdom, the lord of the underground freshwater ocean called the Apsu, and the celestial seas above reflected his sunken watery domain perfectly. Here, the southern path featured 15 constellations, many of them tied to the regenerating waters of the deep. The great one, which we call Aquarius, pouring the waters of life from an overflowing vase. The swallow, which corresponds to Pisces. The sacred fish, which we know as Capricorn. The ancients didn't see any of this as abstract. They understood Enki's path as a literal conduit to the netherworld, the place where the sun descended during the more dormant phase of its journey. Because while Enlil's was the path of the summer sun, when the light travelled through Enki's southern domain, The days shortened, the nights stretched long and cold. The winter solstice had taken hold, and the world waited for the balance to return. And at the center of it all, that balance was held by their father, Anu, ruler of the highest reaches of the heavens and supreme king of the entire Anunnaki Council. His central path spanned the equatorial band of the sky, like a great highway running directly through the middle of the heavens, while his sons governed the seasonal extremes of the year on either end. Anu held the steady center, and it was through his path that the sun, the moon, and the 5 wandering planets of the Bibbu made their regular journeys across the sky. His domain was the primary stage for eclipses, for planetary conjunctions, for all the celestial events that carried astrological weight. And when the sun entered the path of Anu, it also triggered the equinoxes, spring and autumn. Those 2 moments in the year when day and night reached perfect equality across the earth. A symmetry that felt deliberate, felt designed. And in the minds of the astronomers who mapped all of this, it mirrored exactly what Anu was supposed to be, the cosmic arbiter, the one who held the balance that lies between. Under his sweeping gaze were 23 major star groups, including great figures like the lion, which we call Leo, Scorpius, and the great twins Gemini, just to name a few. These were royal constellations, lining the central highway where every meaningful planetary event would eventually unfold. But one constellation in the central corridor held a uniquely special position, the mul, a star cluster positioned at the top of the entire Babylonian catalogue, marking the beginning of the new year. The Pleiades, that small, dense cluster of stars that we now call the 7 Sisters, and together they form the shoulder of the Bull of Taurus. But in earlier traditions, the Pleiades were more largely tied to a different group of primordial entities who existed long before the Anunnaki rose to their thrones. The Sippar, the 7 demons, formless forces of destruction who had once brought chaos to the early world, and who now rested within Anu's central path, as weapons held in reserve, eternal guardians of the cosmic balance. And what these ancient Skywatchers had quietly accomplished was something far bigger than a list of star names, or a conglomeration of mythical symbolism. By mapping all 66 celestial bodies into these 3 divine paths, they had built the world's first complete coordinate system for the sky. A priest sitting atop a quiet temple platform could track the exact night a rising star shifted from Enlil's northern arc down into Anu's central band, and know precisely when to begin the planting, or to prepare for the river's rise. The vastness of the sky had been translated into something ordered, something readable, a map drawn not just in clay but reflected clearly across the heavens themselves. That knowledge didn't stay locked inside temple walls. It moved, it evolved, and buried within their dense columns of cuneiform script was something that would quietly reshape how human beings understood the heavens for the next 3,000 years. Because what the MulApin texts had also recorded was 18 broader distinct constellations lying along the moon's path across the sky. 18 groupings of stars, each one named, each one tied to a season or a rising time. That number isn't arbitrary. It reflects centuries of careful observation, of watching which stars appeared on the horizon just before the dawn, which ones rose as particular seasons shifted, and which ones vanished below the western edge of the world at predictable intervals. This was real data, accumulated slowly, checked against itself, and refined by astronomers who had no instruments beyond their own eyes, and the base 60 mathematics their culture had perfected over generations. And that hexadecimal system, the same one that gave us 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle, is exactly what allowed Babylonian astronomers to take those 18 uneven star groupings and do something truly remarkable with them, something that would echo throughout all time, something that would be remembered and studied, even when the culture who invented it had long since faded into nothing but a distant memory. By dividing the full circle of the sky into 12 equal sectors of 30 degrees each, 12 times 30 equaling 360, they produced a standardized mathematical wheel, one that matched their 12-month lunar calendar almost perfectly. And just like that, across what must have been generations of slow mathematical refinement, the 18 constellations of the MulApin were merged and streamlined into 12. The world's first true zodiac had taken shape. The very heart of the study of astrology, which, wherein it lacks any empirical scientific backing, has a rich history rooted in ancient science, math, and cultural tracking of time. Mapped against very real, very distinct astronomical regions of the night sky, an ancient art that was practiced in one form or another, long before it became tied to modern pop culture, crystals, and mysticism. And what's worth slowing down for is the sheer age of the names themselves, because this is where the star maps start to feel strangely familiar. As the zodiac became more well known, this was when the constellation the ancient scribes used to call Guana, meaning the bull of heaven, became what we now call Taurus. The Bibbu, or the Great Twins, became Gemini. The Great One, the water-bearer, became Aquarius. Scorpio, Virgo, Pisces, Sagittarius, each one carrying a cuneiform name that predates the Greek labels we still use today by thousands of years. These weren't symbols invented for decoration. They were working tools, positions in a celestial calendar, as functional as the marks a farmer cuts into a post to track the seasons. And that's the part that tends to get lost when people talk about the zodiac now. The original Mesopotamian system had almost nothing to do with personal fortune or daily predictions. It was a macrocosmic mirror held up to the entire civilization. When a constellation completed its heliacal rising, appearing just above the eastern horizon in the moments before dawn, it was a signal, a practical one. When Virgo rose in that way, it told the kingdoms below that the river silt along the Euphrates was ready to be ploughed. When Aquarius dominated the night sky, it warned of the flood season approaching. Heaven and earth weren't separate concerns in this system. They were synchronized, one calendar written in two places at once, one carved into clay, and one hanging overhead in the darkness. And the priests who read it weren't mystics disconnected from daily life. They were the civilization's timekeepers, during an age when the clock they watched was one made of the universe itself. And from all of that, something even larger began to take shape. The precise hexadecimal mathematics, the careful geometry, the centuries of dated star coordinates pressed into clay and stored in the great tablet houses of Sippar and Babylon and Nineveh. All of it was slowly building toward a discovery that no single human being could have made alone. Something that, much like before, required not just one brilliant mind, but an unbroken chain of them, each one passing a torch forward across generations they would never live to see, and could hardly fathom. What those accumulated records eventually made possible was the recognition of one of the deepest rhythms in the universe. A cycle so slow it makes the span of human life feel like a single breath. The precession of the Equinoxes. A full rotation taking roughly 26,000 years, sometimes called the Great Year. And the ancient world through sheer discipline and devotion, had laid the groundwork to find it. You see, the Earth doesn't spin perfectly upright. It wobbles, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the planet's axis traces a wide circle in space, like a top that's beginning to lean, but doing it across tens of thousands of years, rather than a few seconds. That wobble shifts which stars appear in the background of the sky during the spring equinox, at a rate of approximately 1 degree every 72 years. Just 1 single degree. In a single human lifetime, that shift is essentially invisible. The stars look fixed. The patterns appear permanent. There is nothing in one person's direct experience that would ever suggest the whole backdrop of the heavens is gradually turning. And yet it is. It's turning in a vast silent circle, and it takes around 25,920 years to complete one full rotation. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus is generally credited with calculating this shift sometime in the 2nd century BCE, and that credit is fair. His calculation was precise, and his methods were rigorous. But here's what's fascinating, what often gets left out of the story. Hipparchus didn't discover precession from scratch. He inherited it. To detect a shift of 1 degree every 72 years, you need star catalogues spanning centuries, with reliable dates attached to each observation. You need records old enough that the slow drift finally becomes measurable. And those records existed because primeval Mesopotamian scribes, all the way from the very first astronomers of Eridu to the Baru priests of the great temple complexes of ancient Sumer and Babylon, had already been keeping them without interruption for hundreds of years. Hipparchus compared his own observations against cuneiform star catalogues that were already considered historical relics in his own time, and without those tablets, the shift would have remained invisible. There was simply no other way to see it. But what makes this even stranger yet, in a mathematical sense, in a way that would not have been lost on a Mesopotamian scribe, is how neatly the numbers of precession align with their base 60 arithmetic. 1 degree of the great year takes 72 years to pass, and 1 full astrological age, meaning the equinox moving through 30 degrees of a single zodiac sign, takes 2,160 years. The equivalent of 60 multiplied by 36. Carry that on through, and you find that 1 complete great year, all 360 degrees, takes 25,920 years. That's 60 multiplied by 432. To a mind already trained to see the universe as a structure built on sexagesimal relationships, this was not a coincidence. It was confirmation. The grandest cycle in the observable heavens was written in the same sacred mathematical language that governed the arc of the night sky, the divisions of the hour, and the geometry recorded on clay tablets and reflected in their intricate city grids. It had always been there, since before writing existed in any recognizable form. Picture a young scribe in Uruk, carefully copying a column of stellar coordinates from a tablet that was already 5 centuries old on the day it was handed to him. The observations he was transcribing were made by a man whose name he didn't know, under a sky that looked almost identical, but oddly offset from his own. He wasn't copying a myth or a prayer. He was copying measurements. Numbers tied to specific stars on specific dates in a specific year. He probably didn't fully understand what those records would one day reveal, but he copied them anyway because that was his solemn duty. That was what was required to see such a greater underlying design, that its influence touches everything all at once and yet barely seems to cause a ripple in anything we can immediately see. And through that quiet discipline, something extraordinary was preserved, because no single astronomer ever watched a constellation drift even one full degree across the sky. Not one of them lived long enough. But together, scribe after scribe, generation after generation, they built a memory that stretched far beyond any individual. And in doing so, they handed us a window into a cycle older than themselves, older than any civilization alive on the face of planet Earth. A memory that was continuously passed on, not as a single revelation, but as something that accumulated slowly, like starlight gathering in still water. Just imagine the sky above ancient Sippar, as the last warmth of the day releases its grip on winding mud-brick streets. The sun drops below the flat horizon, and its amber hues dissolve softly. Without urgency, the way a breath lets go at the end of a long day. And in the space where the light was, something else opens, a deep spreading indigo, the kind of darkness that isn't empty at all, but full of something older than the city below it, full of numerous points of light, each one holding its position with a patience that no living thing has ever matched. Here, the plains of ancient Mesopotamia settle into stillness. The rivers slow, the reeds along the marshy banks stop moving, and the sky, that enormous unbothered sky, simply continues to be what it has always been. There were people who stood in that darkness deliberately, who climbed the smooth white steps of the ziggurat terraces even after the household fires burned low, and who let their eyes adjust to what was above them. And just like the vast open space above, they weren't in a hurry, for there was no hurry needed. The stars would be where the stars would be, moving the way they always moved, following the same unhurried arc they had followed the night before, and the night before that. These watchers carried their reed stylus and their tablets, yes, but they also just stood there sometimes, looking, breathing the cool air that rose from the rivers, letting the Milky Way wash across the sky overhead like a slow river of its own, running on its own path through the deep vault of heaven, carrying light whose origins came from somewhere unimaginably far away. A vault that moves so gently you can't catch it turning. That's what the ancient astronomers knew. It was something you had to surrender to rather than watch. You couldn't stand there and see it move. You could only look away and look back and find that something had shifted in the space between. A constellation that had been balanced on the eastern edge, now dipping below. A planet that had drifted a small fractional distance from the place it had been the night before. The eternal vault of the heavens never announced itself. It just continued, slow and enormous, and completely unbothered by the human eyes below it, tracing its great wheel through the dark, turning the same way it had turned long before the first city wall was laid, and the same way it would turn long after the last one fell. What they built out of that watching lasted. The names they gave to stars traveled forward through every civilization that came after. The measurements they carved into clay survived the empires that rose and dissolved around them. And the people themselves, the ones who stood in the night air and pressed their observations into wet clay, passed quietly into the same darkness they had spent their whole lives studying. Society after glimmering society, empire after empire, they gave their collective wisdom to whoever came next, and the stars kept moving the way they always had. No faster, no slower, no different than they ever had before, carrying the light forward across the long, unbroken chain of history. So if you find your eyes growing heavy, let them fall closed knowing that wherever you are, the sky is still turning, still drifting, still calling to your dreams in the same way it always has. The same slow wheel, the same unbothered arc of light, crossing the same deep tapestry that the watchers of Sumer and Babylonia and Uruk once traced with careful eyes. Your thoughts can soften, loosen, and drift. Allow your breathing to match that ancient steady rhythm. A quiet inhale, a long and gentle release. Feel how the weight of all that has passed simply settles beneath you, fading softly like the last light over the rolling plains, where a profound silence stretches across every long mile, inviting your muscles to relax, easing the quiet space behind your eyes and guiding your awareness into a deep and effortless slumber. Each pulse of light overhead becomes a slow, rhythmic beacon, anchoring you in the stillness of the universe. Time loses its edge as those bright clusters hold their ancient guard, carrying their slow geometry through infinity. We are all a part of this grand journey, simply floating within the great expanse, unbound by hours or distance, sinking further into the celestial seas, where the stars keep their gentle, timeless dance. There's nothing to hold on to, for everything is in its proper place. The world is turning at its own quiet, reliable pace. And somewhere in the depth of all that turning, in the long silence between one star and the next, we find ourselves at rest, cradled in the knowledge of all that was and all that will be.